All right, so you're here with us again on the deep dive, and we know you're busy. You want to get to the bottom of things, like really understand what's going on, but who has time to wade through endless articles and opinions these days, right?
Totally. We get it. That's why we do these deep dives. So today we're going to take you through a pretty significant shift that's happening in technology. Our source is calling it vibe coding, which I have to admit, when I first saw that, I thought it was just some new marketing buzzword.
Right. I mean, it sounds kind of like, I don't know, almost like a little too cool for school, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's actually a lot more interesting than the name might lead you to believe, and it's potentially a really, really big deal.
Okay, so you said we're basing this deep dive on an article, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the article is from UX Collective, written by Pete Sena, and it was published in March of this year, 2025. The title, and get ready for this, is Cracking the Code of Vibe Coding. So there's that word again. But what he's basically talking about is using natural language prompts with AI tools to generate software or app code.
So, like, instead of writing actual code, you just tell the AI what you want the app to do. That's wild.
Yeah, it really is. Imagine you just sit down and describe the app you want. Like, I want an app that does this and that, and it looks like this. And the AI actually starts writing the code for you. It's like magic almost.
Almost. So, in this deep dive, we're going to try to figure out what this vibe coding thing actually means. Like, what are the implications, especially for, people like our listeners? Some of them are hardcore techies, but others are just trying to stay ahead of the curve.
Exactly. We'll look at the benefits, the potential downsides, the whole 9 yards. We want to give you a clear picture of how this could change the future of software development and, maybe even beyond that.
So, where do we start? How does Senna lay this out in the article?
Well, he kicks things off with this idea he calls the great democratization cycle. And I think it's actually a really useful way to understand the big picture here. He says, we've seen this pattern of things becoming more accessible and easier to use throughout history, and it's happened in a bunch of different creative fields.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give us some examples. What kinds of things is he talking about?
Sure. So think about photography, right? It used to be this really complex process. You needed a dark room and all this specialized equipment. Only a few people could really do it well.
Yeah, my parents had one of those old dark rooms in the basement. It was creepy. I mean, like, really cool, but also kind of creepy.
Yeah, totally. But then, digital cameras came along, and then
Mm.
smartphones. Now anyone can take pretty amazing pictures and share them instantly. You don't need any special skills, really.
True. And that's happened with so many things, right? Like publishing. Used to be you needed a printing press and all that. Now you can just start a blog on WordPress or even just post on social media. And video. I mean, forget about it. You used to need a whole studio setup. Now everyone's shooting movies on their phones.
Right. Even music production. Remember, those huge, expensive recording studios, now people are making music on laptops or even just on their phones with AI apps. It's incredible.
It really is. So, Senna's point is that software development is going through the same kind of democratization.
Exactly. It started with traditional coding, which, let's be honest, not everyone can do that. It takes a
Yeah.
lot of time and effort to learn. Then we saw the rise of low-code and no-code platforms, which were supposed to make it easier, drag and drop interfaces and stuff.
Right, like those website builders where you don't have to actually know any HTML or CSS.
Exactly. And now we have these AI-assisted development tools like you might have heard of GitHub Copilot. That's helping coders write code faster and with fewer errors.
Interesting. So where does vibe coding fit into all of this?
So Senna is saying that vibe coding is like the next logical step. He thinks it has the potential to make software development even more accessible, so accessible that anyone, even if you have zero coding experience, could potentially build an app. He mentions platforms like Windsurf, Cursor, Lovable Dev, and Replit as examples.
Okay. But I mean, part of me is thinking if it's that easy, does that mean the quality is going to suffer? Like, is it all just going to be like surface level stuff?
That's a really good question, and that's actually a big part of what Senna grapples with in the article. He talks about he actually calls it the seduction of simplicity.
Okay, I like that. The seduction of simplicity. Go on, tell me more.
So he actually tells this really interesting story about his own experience trying to learn to code back in the day. Classic coder story, like staying up all night, pulling his hair out, trying to figure out why his code wasn't working.
Yeah, I think we've all been there, even if it's not with coding. That feeling of, like, why is this so hard? It should be simple.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then he talks about how he recently used this AI tool called Cursor AI to build an app. He called it the Daddy Time app. And it's like a personal assistant app for dads.
That's cute. So he built this whole app with AI.
Yeah. So he basically just described what he wanted the app to do. Like, he wanted it to be able to connect to local events, pull in weather data, suggest activities based on the weather and what was happening, and then, like, sync with his Google Calendar.
So basically, a pretty sophisticated app.
Right, exactly. And he built the whole thing like a fully functional progressive web app in about 30 minutes without writing any actual code. He just used natural language prompts.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. But, I mean, doesn't that bring us back to that question of, like, the craft of coding? If it's that easy, are we losing something important?
That is exactly the question that Senna wrestles with next, and he calls it the craft crisis, which is a pretty dramatic name.
Okay, the craft crisis. I'm listening. What does he mean by that?
So basically, his argument is this. What happens when the people who are creating things, like software, become really disconnected from the actual materials they're working with?
I think I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. Like, he uses these analogies about painters who never actually touch paint, sculptors who never touch clay, chefs who never taste the ingredients. Would their art, their craft, still have the same, like, soul? Would it even be possible?
Okay, I get the analogy. So he's applying that same logic to software development. Like, if developers aren't actually writing the code, are they losing something essential?
Exactly. And he lists out some of the things we might be risking if we go down this path too far. So first, there's the risk of losing a fundamental understanding of how computer systems actually work.
Mhm.
Like the underlying architecture, how everything fits together.
Which seems important if you want to be able to troubleshoot problems and really understand how things work.
Exactly. Then there's the ability to create elegant and maintainable software solutions. Code that's well structured, easy to understand, easy to update.
Right, because I imagine if you're just throwing prompts at an AI, the code it spits out might not be the prettiest.
It might not be. And that can make it really hard to maintain and update down the road. Then there's the whole thing about developing mental models.
Mental models.
Yeah, like these frameworks that help you understand how software works, how users interact with it, how to design systems that are, robust and scalable.
So, like a deeper level of understanding that goes beyond just being able to generate code.
Right, exactly. And then there's the intuition for things like performance and security, like being able to anticipate potential problems, understanding those kind of edge cases that could really trip you up.
Makes sense. So he's basically saying that if we rely too heavily on AI, we might end up with a generation of developers who can generate code, but they don't really understand what they're doing.
That's a big part of his concern. And to kind of illustrate that point, he actually quotes a Microsoft engineer who said that while LLMs, large language models, can generate code, they often struggle with more complex tasks, like maintaining and extending existing projects. And they can sometimes generate what they call nonsense content.
Nonsense content, that's not a good sign.
Not really. And then he brings up this other point from a tech CTO about the idea of hidden complexities.
Hidden complexities, what does that mean?
So the idea is that the AI might be able to handle like the first 75% of a problem really well, based on those common patterns and stuff.
Right, because that's what AI is good at, pattern recognition.
Exactly. But then that last 25%, that's where things get tricky. That's where you need to deal with like really specific requirements, integrations, making sure the software is secure and scalable.
The stuff that makes it actually work in the real world.
Yeah, exactly. And the concern is that if you're relying too much on AI for that last 25%, you might end up with this like tangled mess of code that's really hard to understand and maintain.
So not just nonsense content, but also just like really messy content.
Right. And then there's the whole security issue.
Yeah.
If it's so easy to generate code, there's a risk that people will use it to create malicious software.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Like if anyone can just type in a prompt and create some kind of malware, that's not great.
Definitely not. He even says like, not a good vibe. Talk about the security risks.
Okay, so we've talked about the technical debt that could accumulate, but Senna also talks about something he calls creative debt.
Yes, that's a really important point, and I think it's something that maybe hasn't gotten as much attention.
So what is creative debt? How does he define that?
So basically, it's the idea that if everyone is relying on AI to generate code using similar prompts and stuff, we might end up with this like lack of originality in software.
Interesting. So it's not just about the code being bad, it's about it being like boring.
In a way, yeah. Like, he argues that real innovation often comes from working within constraints, having to figure out how to do something within the limitations of a particular programming language or a system.
Makes sense. Like
Yeah,
if you have to really think hard about how to solve a problem, you might come up with something more creative.
exactly. But if you can just tell the AI, make me an e-commerce site, you're probably going to end up with something very generic. Like every e-commerce site is going to start to look and feel the same.
So it's almost like this homogenization of the internet where everything just starts to blend together.
Right. And he even uses this phrase AI slop, which I love. It's like this vast landscape of generic, uninspired digital products.
AI slop. I'm gonna have to remember that one. Okay, so we've got the technical debt, the creative debt. What else does Senna talk about?
So then he brings up this idea of the widening knowledge gap. He's basically saying that, like, in this new world of AI-assisted development, we might see two different types of engineers emerge.
Two different types.
Yeah. So on one hand, you'll have the engineers who really understand the fundamentals of software development. They know how to code, they understand how systems work, and they can use AI tools effectively to build sophisticated things.
So they're not just using AI blindly, they're actually guiding it, using it as a tool.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, you'll have engineers who are entirely reliant on the AI's output. They might not even know how to code traditionally. They just know how to give the AI prompts.
And what's the problem with that?
Well, the problem is that when something goes wrong, when you need to troubleshoot a complex issue, that second group of engineers is going to be in trouble. They won't have the deep understanding to figure out what's going on.
So they're basically at the mercy of the AI.
Kind of, yeah. And Senna even quotes an article from The Guardian that says, now you don't even need code to be a programmer, but you do still need expertise.
Expertise, that's the key
It
word.
really is. It's not enough to just be able to generate code. You need to understand how things work, how to solve problems, how to think critically.
So it's almost like we're moving towards this like Swiss Army knife imperative. You need to have a broad set of skills, be able to adapt to different situations.
Yeah, and that actually ties in with some of the other stuff Senna talks about. Like he mentions all the layoffs that have been happening at big tech companies like Amazon, Meta, Microsoft.
Right, because they're all trying to become more efficient, do more with less.
Exactly. And he thinks that vibe coding could actually accelerate that trend. Because if people in non-technical roles like product managers, designers, marketers can suddenly start generating functional code,
That changes the whole game.
it does. Suddenly, the most valuable skill isn't necessarily being able to write code. It's being able to identify the right problems to solve and clearly communicate those problems to the AI.
So it's almost like a shift from like execution to strategy.
Exactly. And he quotes the CEO of Replit, Amjad Masad, who said that 75% of their customers never write a single line of traditional code.
Wow, 75%. That's a huge number.
It is. So, this is all happening really fast. And Senna, he actually provides some mental models to help us make sense of it all.
Mental models. Okay, lay it on me.
So the first one is the creation-maintenance divide.
The creation maintenance divide, what's that all about?
So he's basically saying that while vibe coding might be really good for creating initial versions of software, getting something up and running quickly.
Right, because it seems like that's where AI really shines, that initial burst of creativity.
Exactly. But the real challenge, the thing that's going to require more and more expertise, is maintaining that software over time, updating it, fixing bugs, making sure it stays secure.
So it's almost like the AI can do the quick and dirty work, but the humans still need to come in and clean it up.
That's a good way to put it. And that means that the value of traditional coding skills, the ability to write clean, maintainable code, is only going to increase.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the next mental model?
Okay, so this one is called the 3 tiers of software creators.
The 3 tiers of software creators. I like it.
So he says that you can think of software creators as falling into 3 different categories. At the bottom, you have the prompt engineers.
Prompt engineer sounds fancy.
It does, right. But basically, these are the people who are really good at using AI to generate code. They know how to write effective prompts. They understand the AI's capabilities and limitations.
Okay, so they're like the AI whisperers.
Exactly. Then moving up, you have the solution architects.
Solution architects, so they're a step above the prompt engineers.
Yeah. So these are the people who can not only use AI effectively, but they can also see the bigger picture. They can understand the user's needs, the business goals, and they can design solutions that meet those needs using AI.
So they're more strategic.
Right. And then at the very top, you have the system innovators.
System innovators, that sounds like the top of the food chain.
It kind of is.
Mhm.
These are the people who are pushing the boundaries, coming up with completely new ideas, creating things that AI hasn't even seen before.
So they're the true visionaries.
Yeah, exactly. And Senna's argument is that as AI becomes more powerful, your value is going to depend on which tier you're in.
So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, you need to move up the ladder.
You do. You need to be able to do more than just generate code. You need to be able to think critically, solve problems creatively, and come up with new ideas.
Okay, what's the next mental model?
So the third one is this shift from intellectual leverage to execution leverage.
Intellectual leverage versus execution leverage. Okay, break that down for me.
So traditionally, software has provided execution leverage. It automates tasks, makes us more efficient.
Right, like instead of having to do everything manually, we can use software to do it faster and more accurately.
Exactly. But vibe coding, Senna argues, is providing intellectual leverage.
Intellectual leverage, what does that mean?
It means that the AI is actually helping us with the thinking part. It's not just automating tasks, it's helping us solve problems, design solutions, come up with new ideas.
This is like having a super smart brainstorming partner.
Kind of, yeah. And that means that our focus needs to shift. Instead of just focusing on building things right, we need to focus on building the right things.
Building the right things. That's a good distinction.
It is. It's about making sure that we're solving the right problems, creating software that's actually valuable and useful.
Okay, I'm with you. What's the last mental model?
All right, so this one is called the specialization paradox.
The specialization paradox. That sounds intriguing.
Yeah. So in the past, it was all about specialization. You had to be an expert in one very specific area to be successful.
Like you were a front-end developer or a back-end developer or a database specialist.
Exactly. But Senna thinks that as AI becomes more powerful, that might actually start to change. He thinks that success in the future might actually depend more on being able to connect ideas across different domains.
So like being a generalist.
In a way, yeah. Like being able to see the big picture, understanding how different parts of a system fit together, being able to learn new things quickly.
So it's almost like the AI is taking care of the specialization and the humans need to focus on the synthesis.
That's a great way to put it, and that's a pretty big shift.
Okay, so we've talked about all the potential challenges, but Senna also offers some recommendations, right? Like how to navigate this new landscape.
He does. So first of all, he's very clear that he's not saying we should reject AI altogether.
Yeah.
He even compares it to like abandoning power tools and going back to using only hand tools.
Right, because AI is a powerful tool. It can make us more efficient, more creative.
Exactly. But it's about using it strategically, not letting it completely replace human skills and expertise.
So it's about augmentation, not replacement.
Exactly. And he gives some specific advice for individual creators.
Mm.
So first and foremost, he says, learn the fundamentals. Don't just rely on AI to do everything for you.
Like don't skip learning how to code altogether.
Right. Learn how to code, learn how systems work, understand the basic principles. Then, he says, use AI as a collaborator. Like treat it as a partner, not just a tool.
So like have a conversation with it.
Yeah, kind of. Like give it prompts, see what it comes up with, but then critically evaluate its output. Don't just blindly accept whatever it generates.
So be skeptical.
Exactly. Challenge the AI, ask it questions, make sure you understand what it's doing and why. And then he talks about developing what he calls T-shaped expertise.
T-shaped expertise, what's that?
So it's like this. The vertical part of the T is your deep knowledge in one specific area. Like maybe you're an expert in front-end development or machine learning.
Okay, so that's your specialty.
Right. But then the horizontal part of the T is your broad understanding of other areas. Like you have a basic understanding of design, user experience, maybe even business strategy.
So you can see how your specialty fits into the bigger picture.
Exactly. And Sina thinks that this kind of T-shaped expertise is going to be increasingly valuable in the future.
Okay, so that's for individual creators. What about teams and organizations? What advice does he give them?
Yeah, so he has a whole section on that. So first of all, he says that teams need to establish really robust review processes for AI-generated code.
So like, don't just assume that the AI is always going to get it right.
Exactly. You need to have experienced developers who can look at the code, make sure it's clean, secure, maintainable. Then he talks about building balanced teams.
Balanced teams.
Yeah, like teams that have a mix of people. Some who are really excited about AI and some who are more grounded in traditional coding skills.
So you have that balance of like innovation and expertise.
Right. And then he talks about the importance of education. like investing in training programs that teach people about system-level thinking, software architecture, those deeper concepts that AI might not be able to teach.
So, like, upskilling your workforce for this new era.
Exactly. And then there's the whole thing about documentation, like making sure that all AI-generated code is well documented so that people can understand how it works and how to maintain it.
Okay, so that's a lot of good advice. But, one of the things that really struck me in the article was this example he gave about distribution as the new cheat code.
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting one.
So he talks about Peter Levels, who created Nomad List, that website for digital nomads.
Right. Yeah, I know that site.
So Levels used these vibe coding techniques to build the latest version of his other website, Remote OK Jobs, the job board for remote work.
Okay. Yeah.
And he built the whole thing like a fully functional website in 6 hours.
6 hours? That's insane.
It is. Like, he literally had the idea in the morning, and by the evening, he had a website up and running with thousands of
Oh,
users.
well. So what's his secret?
Well, according to Senna, Level said that he only spent about 20% of his time on the actual building of the website. He spent the other 80% of his time on marketing and distribution.
That's a complete flip from how things used to be.
It is, and that's Senna's point. He's saying that in this new era of vibe coding, distribution is becoming the most important thing.
Because if it's so easy to build software, everyone's going to be doing it.
Huh.
So the real challenge is going to be getting your software in front of people, getting them to use it.
So it's not enough to just build a great product. You need to be able to market it, distribute it, build a community around it.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because it means that the people who are going to be most successful in the future might not be the best coders, but the best marketers, the best community builders.
The people who understand their audience and know how to reach them.
Exactly. And Senna even uses this phrase, disrupting the disruptors, which I think is really apt.
Disrupting the disruptors. What does he mean by that?
So for the past few years, we've seen this rise of no-code and low-code platforms.
Right. The whole idea that you don't need to know how to code to build software.
Yeah. And those platforms have been really disruptive. They've made it possible for anyone to build websites, apps, all sorts of things.
But now vibe coding is coming along and potentially disrupting those platforms.
That's Senna's argument. Like, why spend all this time learning how to use a visual programming interface when you can just describe what you want in plain English?
Makes sense. So what does that mean for the future of no code and low code?
Well, Senna thinks they're going to have to evolve. He thinks we're going to see a lot of them start to integrate AI capabilities.
So, like, instead of dragging and dropping blocks of code, you'll just be able to type in what you want.
Yeah, exactly. And that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What are, like, the key takeaways? What do we want listeners to remember about vibe coding?
I think first and foremost, it's important to understand that this is a really powerful technology that has the potential to change a lot of things. It could make software development much more accessible. It could speed up innovation. It could even lead to completely new types of software that we haven't even imagined yet.
So, huge potential, but also potential risks.
Definitely. We talked about the technical debt, the creative debt, the widening knowledge gap. These are all things we need to be aware of.
And it seems like the key is going to be finding that balance, between embracing the power of AI and maintaining that human expertise.
Exactly. And I think the people who are going to be most successful in the future are going to be the ones who can do both, who can use AI effectively, but who also understand the fundamentals, who can think critically, who can solve problems creatively.
The T-shaped people.
Exactly. And, Senna ends the article with this really provocative question. He asks, will vibe coding ultimately amplify human creativity, or will we risk creating a world of generic, mostly working software?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that we're all going to have to grapple with in the years to come because this technology is here, it's evolving rapidly, and it's going to have a profound impact on all of us.
It really is. And I think the most important thing is to stay informed, stay curious, and be willing to adapt. Because the future of software development, and maybe even the future of creativity itself, is going to look very different than it does today.
Well said. Food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll see you next time.